Hey guys, welcome to the weekly question video where we answer your questions. If you want to leave us a question, the easiest way to do that is in the comments, or you can email us. Our email is in the description box, as well as a link to our Patreon if you want to support what we're doing and get some bonus content. Today's question is one that I don't think we've ever really discussed on the podcast, so this is going to be a brand new conversation. The question is, should you have a formal contract for your domestic discipline relationship? This one is kind of an interesting question because I can see maybe where an application of more of a contract could be beneficial, but I also see where it can be completely unnecessary, kind of depending on the situation. This concept of a formal contract is something that has come from more of the BDSM side of power dynamic relationships. So it's not something that I would say is necessary in domestic discipline 100% of the time. However, there are some couples who practice domestic discipline in ways that are different than what we talk about on the podcast. From the standpoint of there are people out there that have platonic domestic discipline arrangements with people that are not their romantic partners, that it is more of a disciplinarian and, accountability type of situation. And in those cases, I can definitely see where a contract would be beneficial because, you're most likely not living with this person. And even if you are, you're not in a daily relationship with them. You're not having that level of communication and intimacy that you would have with a spouse or with a romantic partner. So I can see how the application of a contract could be beneficial there. However, on the podcast, we talk more about lifestyle domestic discipline. And what I mean by that is domestic discipline that happens as part of your daily life, part of how you function as a couple. And we primarily talk to couples who are practicing domestic discipline as a part of their marriage or their long-term committed relationships. And in those situations, I don't necessarily think that a formal contract is necessary. I know for myself that no contract that Coda and I could make up for domestic discipline would supersede our marriage contract. The commitment that we made to each other in our marriage is enough of a contract that we don't necessarily need something for domestic discipline specifically. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there are no limits and no boundaries. We obviously have talked about all of that. We're in constant communication about those things, so a formal contract would just kind of be redundant. And you might think well, what if there's issues of consent? Again, we've had those discussions. So when you're in a long-term committed relationship, if you are married, then you kind of have this idea of what domestic discipline is going to look like in your relationship. It's not situational. It's not something that you only do part of the time. At least not with the couples that we've talked about, at least not in our relationship, nor is that something that we would suggest. We would suggest that if you're going to be in a domestic discipline relationship, that this really is something that you integrate into every aspect of your life as a couple, every part of your relationship, because there is not a time when Coda is not my authority. There is not a time where I am not accountable to his authority. I know that I still have to check in with him. I know that I'm still accountable to him. And so to have a formal contract seems really redundant, right? Because if I am accountable to him for everything I do, if he's the authority in every aspect of our home and of my life, then why do we need that written out? Now, we have mentioned before, and I still do think it's a good idea, that you have some sort of written account of your rules, or at least of the core pillars of your relationship. That way, if there's ever a situation that kind of comes into question and you're like, have we really talked about that? Have we established that as a boundary? You can go back to that and just look and say, okay, we haven't really talked about this specific situation, but it falls into a core pillar, so we can definitely address that, right? And so it's kind of helpful to have some sort of written account of just things that you've talked about, things that you've established, whether those are the rules or the pillars or just the foundation of your relationship, right? But even that part's not completely necessary if that's not something that is a helpful tool for you. Coda and I are very, very organized, very meticulously organized people. So we like to have those written accounts, but if that's not something that's helpful to you, you don't have to have it. You can run your domestic discipline just on the core pillars of, respect, obedience, and safety, and honesty, and all of those things. You can just be like, look, I expect certain, as a head of household, you can be like, I expect my wife to conduct herself in this way, and if she doesn't, then there's accountability. You can absolutely do that, but we do find it helpful to have some sort of kind of just written log of things that we have discussed and have decided are priorities in our relationship, but that's not a contract. Also, I think that some people misconstrued having a contract as, a written form of consent, that would somehow protect you if there was ever a legal question of whether or not what you're doing is legally okay. Those sort of written contracts, even in the BDSM world, they have been called into question when things go awry and there's legal proceedings because of it. They don't hold up. So even if you're like, well, I want a written contract so that, if anything ever happens and my wife wants to claim that I was abusive towards her, and this contract would give me the ability to say, no, she consented, that's not really going to protect you. It's just not. And so, I mean, it's great if you want to have that peace of mind, but even from that standpoint, it's really not helpful or necessary. So all in all, I say that a contract, if that is something that you really find value in, and that is a tool that you can use to have those intentional conversations and have that, know where those boundaries are, go for it. But it's really not necessary. It's not something that it's not something I would even suggest. I would be more likely to suggest that you go through a boot camp to have all those intentional conversations rather than write out a contract. That's just me. And I don't even think that you have to do a boot camp. If you want to have those intentional conversations, you can do that outside of those two scenarios, and that's fine too. I think that when you are living with someone, when you are married to someone, you get to know them so intimately, and you get to know the ins and outs of what to expect from them, what's expected of you, that having these like written documents really doesn't become a necessary part of your power dynamic relationship. It is just something that you live and you gain experience and you start to function within, and it becomes your lived experience to the point where that's just how you are as a couple and as a person, and that's how your home functions. And the more you get used to that, the more you acclimate to that, the less likely you are to ever need to reference any type of written document, whether that be your written rules, your written foundational pillars of your relationship, or a contract. And so really, again, if you think it would be helpful to you, there's nothing that says you can't. It's just not something that I would necessarily say is helpful or necessary. You do need to make sure that what you're doing is something that both people in the relationship are coming together and doing together. It's not one person imposing this lifestyle or this discipline structure onto another. It is two people coming together and saying, yes, we're going to use this to work towards our goals, and we both agree that this is what we want for our relationship. And as long as you have that, you are so good. Like, you're good. You don't need anything else. So I hope that uh, gave you some perspective, gave you some things to think about, and we will talk to you guys next time.